Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I am here with John and Gabriel Shipton. They are the father and brother of Julian Assange. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Sabrina.
With you. Thanks.
So I want to start off by asking, when was the last time that you were allowed to see Julian?
I think you saw him.
Well, yeah, I saw him at the beginning of November last year. Yeah, when I was over in the UK, saw him at the prison in Belmarsh, where on April 11th he will have been for 4 years. It's a very, it's the maximum security prison, and just coming in and out of there, you really get a sense of this sort of oppression that you're entering. Your mouth's all checked. They check the bottom of your feet with their hand like this for different things. You take off quite a lot of your clothing just to get through security. And they now have they have a dog there now, which they didn't have before, that just before you go into the visiting area, you have to walk and the dog will sniff you, but also jump up on your back to sniff in your hair. And Julian's small children have to go through this procedure as well. One's 4 and the other's 5. So it is a very... just going to see him is you really do feel as a visitor that the intensity and the oppression of that prison.
How often are you allowed to see him?
His family can see him twice a week now.
Okay.
Yeah, so he gets 2 visits a week with Stella and the children. So that's really good that he's able to get that. For a long time, he didn't have those sorts of visiting rights. For instance, during the COVID period, he didn't have a visit, I think, for 8 or 9 months. And you can see in Ithaca, the film, that he was... they had these things called purple calls, which was a video call that you were allowed to do from the prison to Stella, his wife.
What would you say the conditions are like in Belmarsh? I've never been to a prison or a maximum security prison. What would you say the conditions are like, at least for him?
Yeah, most certainly. When he first went there, he was locked in what they call the health wing, which the prisoners known as the hell wing. And there you're isolated with a couple. There's the pod of the health wing, each one has 4 beds, and there you're isolated with people who have gone mad or wish to die, or in very dire straits on their deathbed. So it's a place which increases the intensity of isolation and the intensity of depressive illnesses. It's quite bizarre, and particularly as the psychiatrist, Dr. Daly, was felt to be unsympathetic. She didn't have a sympathetic character. So the prisoners all got together and wrote a petition to the prison governor to get Julian moved into association, that is, into the prison proper. Association in the over 50s, although Julian at that stage was 48, I think, or 49. That failed, so the prisoners did another petition to have Julian moved into association. Again, that failed, so the prisoners did a third petition, which succeeded. So the prisoners, despite their circumstances and their crimes, took the most vigorous and firm and determined move to extend to Julian humanity. The great humanist organisations of the world were still waiting for something to happen. They weren't in. But that illustrates what the now Julian is in the association wing with the over 50s. He and 2 other prisoners are the longest serving prisoners in that wing. The turnover is very high there as they find other prisons to put the prisoners in, distribute them around the United Kingdom for some reason or other, I don't know why. However, Julian is the longest there, 2 prisoners now, and he's in his cell 23 hours a day. There is another problem, is that Julian applies to go to the court hearings, and that is refused. Okay, he can't go to his own court. And the basis of that refusal are COVID and the capacity to have TV access, or Zoom access as is known over here. Now that brings about another circumstance, that we finally and fully understand that Julian Assange is held incommunicado. That is, isolated from his supporters, public, family, only get 2 visits a week, fully isolated and can't speak for himself. This in itself is an oppression of Julian's human rights, let alone keeping Julian in the hell wing for over a year.
Wow, that's interesting. From what I understand, even though he is at Belmarsh, he actually hasn't been convicted of a crime, correct?
That's right. He's been held there solely at the request of the US DOJ. He's unconvicted, not serving a sentence. That's why it's often strange going to visit him, because you'll have other prisoners who are talking about the day they're going to get out, or what they're planning for when they get released. But with Julian, we just don't know. It's sort of a never-ending court proceeding, and this whole time he's been kept in this prison that's has convicted murderers in it, convicted terrorists and things like that. And I think John's point about the prisoners, it was the prisoners petitioning that changed Julian's situation, and I think that sort of speaks to that Julian's situation is not going to change, from the top down. It's not the lawyers who are asking the prison to change his situation that worked. It's not the UN Special Rapporteur who found that Julian was being psychologically tortured that changed his position. It came from the bottom up, from the prisoners in the prison, putting forward these 3 petitions. So I think that's a really neat way to see, how things actually change in Julian's case, and it's from us, from the people, not from a changing government or
Right.
things like that.
Right. This is a message that we tell people a lot, like on the show, like it really does come from the people. Have you heard any type of communication from Merrick Garland or President Biden in reference to Julian's situation?
No, nothing at all, except Mark Raimondi, after the change of government, the Biden administration moved in. Mark Raimondi is the Department of Justice spokesperson for the Department of Justice National Security section, the small section. He came out and said, nothing will change in this persecution. We will continue. That's all we've heard.
That's interesting. Is Julian aware of the amount of support that he has? Because I can imagine him being in some sort of isolation or not having access to TV, therefore the news, the media. Is he aware, for example, that there were over 5,000 people that surrounded the parliament in the UK that came out in support of him?
Gabriel's good on that one.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, that keeps him going inside the prison, hearing about these things. I mean, John and Stella and us, we're his lifeline, to the outside world, to all the support that's going on. And that really keeps him going, hearing about these things. I think he's spoken to John, while we're here, and John, like last night, telling him, we had 100 and something people in Dennis, Massachusetts, this tiny town with a population of 200,000. A fair number of them came out to see Ithaca the film about his family's fight to free him, and also talked to us. I think we did a 45-minute Q&A after the film, and people want to know what they can do, how they can help, and because people are beginning to understand what this means to them, what this means to their rights, that it's, Julian Assange is in prison, but he's in prison because it's an attack on us, on our rights, and our right to know what our governments do in our name.
That's right. Mainstream media has made this mistake or this reference before, referring to him as a terrorist or a hacker. And I think it's important for people to understand that Julian Assange was a journalist, so he was doing his job. There have been other political prisoners that have ran into this situation as well. Daniel Hale is one of them. And I think that it speaks to the point of censorship, which has become a hot button issue, at least in this country recently. How do you feel about free speech? Do you feel like we're going forward or we're going backwards?
Let's hit that ball right out of the park. Well, obviously, with the persecution of a publisher, with the terrible circumstances under the Espionage Act, which has in it death. So in the case of Chelsea Manning, there were 22 charges against Chelsea. The 22nd charge was a death sentence. She only got out of it through good fortune and firm fighting, and 21 of the charges were allocated to 35 years in jail. 7 years later was commuted. So that circumstance alone begins to build up pressure on an understanding that our First Amendment rights, the United States Constitution, First Amendment rights, that is, free speech and a free press, are being amended, blighted, and circumscribed by the government. In particular, in the case of Julian Assange, and examples, as you mentioned, Hale, Donziger, one after the other, our capacity to relate to each other through a burden of knowledge and understanding is being progressively reduced. Another aspect of censorship of the First Amendment is the extraterritorial application of the United States laws. Julian is in the United Kingdom, an Australian citizen, and yet he's being returned to the United States, extradited to the United States with a threat of 175 years in jail, despite the fact that those laws don't apply to an Australian citizen nor to the English courts.
That's right. Yeah. Right, that makes sense. Why do you feel he was sent to Belmarsh instead of back to his
maximum
home?
security prison, taking away his right to communicate and taking away his right to free movement. Yeah. They say that they're concerned that Julian might run away, but where can you run to? Well, you can't run anywhere, really. And also he has 2 children, a family in London, has Gabriel and I in London on occasion. He also has an uncle and a nephew, so he's really sewn in to the United Kingdom. The only excuse that they can give for keeping Julian Assange in a maximum security prison is to reduce his capacity to defend himself. That's all. No other.
That makes sense. When I first heard about Julian Assange's situation, I thought about Edward Snowden. And I think that should have been the first warning sign to a lot of us. Look at what they could do. Now, Edward Snowden, last I heard, he's still in Russia. He cannot come back to the United States. Have you heard anything from people like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning in reference to support for Julian Assange?
Well, before Gabrielle's good on that, before Gabrielle answers, I'd just like to add that Edward Snowden solicitors regularly make the offer to return to the United States if a fair trial is given. He regularly makes that offer. Similarly, Julian, in those 13 years, it's the total, 7.5 years in the embassy, 1.5 years in the house arrest, 4 years in the jail in April, regularly made the offer to go to Sweden to be interviewed if they would declare they wouldn't I've forgotten the word, send him onwards to the United States. If they were genuine in their inquiry in these allegations, he would go to Sweden and they would say, we're not going to forward you on to the United States, we just want to answer these questions. It never happened, ever. They made the declaration, his lawyers made the declaration every year. It still didn't happen. Sorry.
No, Snowden's been an incredible advocate for Julian. Over the years, he's multiple times come out. He's always advocating for Julian's freedom, and I think he looks at his situation and then looks at Julian's situation and says, he has 2 small children as well. He's able to be with his wife and family. So he says, I am better off than Julian Assange, and that's the sort of framing of his advocacy for Julian. And, he has a pretty good view on what the people that Julian's up against are capable of. He's worked for the National Security Agency, for Booz Allen, the contractor. He's had access, to all those files, the files that he leaked, as well as more than we've ever seen. So he has a unique understanding into what these agencies are actually capable of.
Right. What would need to be done for him to be freed?
Simplest thing in the world, if I may say so. The really most elegant thing. All the Department of Justice Attorney General has to do is drop the charges and it's all over. He can go home to his family. Just drop the charges. It's not... and the charges themselves are dubious, and they've brought disgrace to the Swedish prosecuting authority and disgrace now to the Crown Prosecuting Service in its manipulation of due process and irregular contacts with the Swedish prosecuting authority and the FBI. All of those irregularities, including the CIA bugging the embassy over and over again for 18 months, and the suborning of the conventions of asylum, dragging Julian out of the embassy without a fair hearing to remove his remove his, remove his capacity to be an asylee. That has not been done. So everything along the way would disappear, and you would find that the Department of Justice in the United States, the Crown Prosecuting Service and the Swedish Prosecuting Authority could go about renewing how the public see them in the circumstances of, Hale, Assange, Snowden, etc., but in particular Assange.
Mm.
And I think what we're seeing now, you mentioned earlier the sort of online activity in October, as well as the huge human chain protest in London. That's sort of followed on by, on the 30th of November last year, there were the 5 prestige newspapers who collaborated with WikiLeaks on the diplomatic cable set release.
Mm-hmm.
On the 10th anniversary of their collaboration with WikiLeaks, they released a joint letter to the Garland Department of Justice. These are, big corporate establishment. I call them prestige media.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. They now see that their stature and their place in our societies is under threat due to this prosecution, which is why they're writing this letter to Garland. And so the next day after they've sent this letter, the Australian Prime Minister publicly, for the first time, says that he's made representations to the Biden administration. He's had other comments saying enough's enough, and he doesn't see what purpose what purpose is served by keeping Julian in prison. But this is the first time he's said publicly. And then you have another 10 days later, the Press Freedom Coalition, which is made up of ACLU, Freedom of the Press Foundation, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. These aren't fringe groups. These are international human rights groups, mainstream groups, that are sort of, a lot of them get funding from the US government as well, particularly Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. So these groups wrote another letter to Garland. And so you have these three events all in a row following on from these grassroots events. And now we're seeing in the Congress a group forming, a Dear Colleagues letter led by Rashida Tlaib. Mm-hmm. And we know that there are 4 sign-ons to this letter already. And so you can, sort of follow this, the dominoes, if you will, these dominoes falling one after the other. And they just keep getting bigger and bigger. And I think the pressure from Congress is very, very important in this case. And, I can encourage all the people who listen to your podcast, get in touch with your congressperson. Yep. Ask them to sign this letter. As we travel around the country, we're encouraging everyone we speak to just ring them, ring them up and ask them to sign on to this letter that Rashida Tlaib's signed on to. And also another interesting event that happened at the end of last week, Pramila Jayapal, who's a progressive, she's the leader of the Progressive Caucus. Mm-hmm. She had a town hall meeting in Seattle. They're all doing their town halls now because the election's coming up. And there were some activists there, grassroots, Seattle for Assange. Mm-hmm. And one of them was filming and another one asked her a question, do you support the dropping of the charges against Julian Assange? And she said yes. And so she is now on the record saying that she supports the charges being dropped against Julian. So I think as people's elections campaigns roll on, we're going to see, more and more of this. I think it's an issue for people, and it's going to be raised in these forums. And it's really the litmus test now, like for almost for democracy. If you support the freedom of Assange, it means you support a free press. It means you support democratic right to know. And so it's a great way for politicians to be able to say, look, this is a democracy, and I support one of its key pillars, which is a free press. Robert Kennedy Jr. did this great tweet the other day, and he said, there is no America without a free press.
That's right.
And there is no free press without a free Assange.
That's right. Well said. One of the things I did learn from Julian is that he really woke me up to what the war industry is about. There was a statement he made where he said that the goal is to create this never-ending war and thus like funneling money. And I never really thought about it in that way, but he really captured my attention about that. And I did more research and I started to see how the military-industrial complex is all connected to a lot of these wars and how these wars are they're profit-driven. How do you feel about the rebuilding of an anti-war movement? There have been multiple rallies. There was a rally in DC recently I saw that you spoke at. There was one a couple weeks before that as well. How do you feel about rebuilding an anti-war movement globally?
Well, I think something that has inadvertently happened through Julian's persecution is there's now a movement that has formed around him and around freeing him, and that's a global movement. There's parliamentary groups in every Western democracy now, and they're bipartisan groups. Mm-hmm. So they're not. They all care about this essential ingredient to democracy. The right to know what our governments do in our name. And I think Julian speaks to this. Julian has spoken to this quite well, where he says, populations, they don't like wars. And so if the media and the press is playing its role correctly and educating the population about what's going on, then I think peace is easy. But if we have a corrupt media or a media that is just parroting what the military-industrial complex wants it to, then we're going to be led down these pathways to war.
That's right. How do people in Australia feel about Julian's situation?
88% support Julian to return home quick. So that's pretty good, huh? The 50 in the parliamentary group, that's about a quarter of our entire parliamentary body. So every journalist association in the world, in the Western world, supports the dropping of the charges. The Council of Europe supports the dropping of the charges, and so on. The High Commissioner of Human Rights in the United Nations, the working group, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture and Unusual Punishment, all together yell at the top of their voices, leave him go.
Well said, well said. My final question for you is, what would you want people to know about Julian? And I ask that because a lot of people know of him because of his journalism and because of his situation right now. But is there something about Julian that you would want other people to know that they may not know?
There's lots, but...
Yeah, I think, if you come down and see Ithaca, and really in that documentary, what we really tried to do, or what I think you will see in the film, is you will learn a different side of Julian. You will learn about Julian as a father, as a husband, and as a brother, and that's how we know him. We know him as a loving father who reads stories to his children when they come and visit him, helps them draw pictures and different things like that. So I think getting to know Julian in a different way, if you come down and see the film, it's a very a neat way to do that, I think. But just that, he's a gentle genius that I have a lot of respect for. But maybe John has something to add.
Oh, it's a vulnerable. He's a man and stands firmly for his kids, stands alongside his wife unmovably, and expresses gratitude to Gabriel and I, and embraces the support that he gets worldwide, and retains his integrity despite the fact that he's been mobbed, scandalous slander, unceasingly for 13.5 years. He still stands erect facing that hurricane wind, Well, I think that's pretty nice.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today.
Thank
you, Sabrina. Thanks.
Sabrina. I'm dried mouth and tongue-tied now. Too much talking.
We have sabrinasalvati. She is an activist, former educator, and host of the Sabs podcast, and co-host of the Revolutionary Blackout Network. Please give a warm welcome for sabrinasalvati.
When I studied journalism in undergrad, my professors told me that journalism was about reporting the facts. What they did not tell me was that there are certain agencies that do not want some facts or truths reported. Sometimes that decision lies in the hands of an editor, a publisher, a platform, or the United States government. Julian Assange is currently imprisoned for reporting the facts, for revealing harsh truths about U.S. war crimes. He's being tortured for doing his job. Some government officials, like John Bolton, have called Julian a criminal. I disagree. Journalism should not be a crime. But I would ask John Bolton, where is that same outrage for the real criminals? Where is that same outrage for the clients of Jeffrey Epstein? Where is that same outrage for the Wall Street bankers that stole people's homes during the housing crisis? Those are the real criminals, and they walk among us freely. Independent journalists like Julian are critical and necessary because media outlets such as CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC spread lies every day to the American people. They regurgitate the same narrative from the State Department, the narrative that the U.S. government has decided is acceptable. If commentators like Anderson Cooper told the truth, the real truth, would he still be employed at CNN? Make sure I got a page. If you're wondering why you should care about what's happening to Julian, if you value free speech or free press, then you should be very concerned about his ordeal. Over the past year, I've watched independent journalists and commentators struggle with censorship on various platforms. I've seen them have their work deleted, sometimes work that was published years ago. I've seen journalists demonetized and deplatformed, some of whom I know personally, and I know they do good work. I've seen Wikipedia pages smearing anti-war voices. And speaking of war, if you discuss Russia and Ukraine differently than mainstream media, you will also be censored or deplatformed. That's right. The same goes for Israel and Palestine, Syria, and Yemen. Censorship did not start with Julian Assange, and he is not alone. We must also mention voices like Daniel Hale and Mumia Jamal. But we must also ask our representatives in DC, where do they stand on this issue? In particular, the progressive members in Congress. With the exception of Ilhan Omar, where does the squad stand on Julian Assange and the issue of free speech? Why are they silent on this issue? If they're not willing to stand up for free speech, then they will vote accordingly. And we may not have independent media, the same media that gave them a platform when CNN would not. The same media that got them elected. So this time, it's Julian Assange. Next time, it could be someone else if we don't protect free speech. Next time, it could be you.